Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Chris Zaczyk. He's an MBA student here, and he's also a member of the UW Missing in Action program. He was born in Chicago, Illinois. What are you going to be doing tomorrow?
Not watching football. Got a baby at home.
My 14. Yeah. I'll just move on after that. Okay, he went to high school at Victor J. Andrew High School in Tinley Park, and then he went to college at St. Norbert in De Pere, which is my first joke about Wisconsin I ever heard, because when the Padre got there and they stepped out of the canoe, what did they say? It's deep here. Yeah. I think the Jesuits tell that joke better than I do. He studied economics and business, and he went through the ROTC program and was commissioned into the regular Army. He's now at the rank of captain and has been company commander in armor, including tanks and mechanized reconnaissance vehicles. He's in the 101st Airborne, which grew out of which state's militia in the Civil War? That would be Wisconsin. And that's why they have the old Abe eagle on their patch. He served in Iraq in 2011 and again in Afghanistan in 2013-2014. As you see, today is September 4th. September 1st is usually considered the anniversary of the start of World War II with the German invasion of Poland, and then on September 3rd, the British officially declared war on Germany, as did the French. So we are now in this period where we're going to be commemorating the 80th anniversary of a lot of stuff from World War II over the next 6 years. And so I think it's an appropriate time and day to talk about the UW Missing in Action program. Originally, the topic that I had was recovering U.S. airmen lost in World War II from the fields of France to the forests of Belgium. I think Chris is going to talk some about that, but he's also going to talk about the broader implications of the program and where they hope to take it. So would you please join me in welcoming Chris Zaczyk to Wednesday night.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Dr. Zinnan, thank you for the introduction. I'd like to just extend a special thanks to Chuck Kaczynski, the Associate Director of the Biotech Center, for allowing me to speak, and then the Biotech Center as a whole for housing the UW-MIA project. Tonight, we're going to talk about war stories. Specifically, we are going to talk about how we are honoring Wisconsin Missing in Action soldiers by the retelling of their stories. And there's still a lot of them that need to be told. We're going to address this in a couple of different ways. The first thing we're going to do is take things wide and look at the national problem with MIAs. I think it's a lot bigger. If you're not well versed in the topic, it's a lot bigger than most people realize. We're going to talk a little bit about the organization, and like Dr. Zinnan said, we are going to cover some of the details about our previous recovery cases. And then we're going to talk about how analytics and new technology that we're bringing to this analysis of MIA cases is helping us hone in our research efforts and hopefully in the future bring more folks home. And then we're going to talk about how these same tools are allowing us to bring history to life with Wisconsinites all across the state by giving them an interactive platform to connect with the history and the sacrifice of MIAs, specifically in Wisconsin, but someday hopefully nationally. So I'd like to start by defining a war story. So the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a war story as a story of a memorable personal experience, typically involving an element of danger, hardship, or adventure. You don't have to go to war to have a war story. Everyone in this room has war stories, and you have people who you share them with. But for tonight, I'd ask that you take a moment to reflect on some of the stories of service that you've experienced, either from a friend, a family member, perhaps a colleague. Maybe they're war stories of your own. And I want you to continuously ask yourself, how have those war stories, how have those stories of service impacted you? the way you see the world, the way you view that service member, and how much different your life is as a result of being able to learn from those experiences and those war stories that make up the fabric of our state and our nation. I'll talk next about why war stories are important. And I'll do that by introducing you to someone who's extremely important to me. In the top left there, that's my grandpa, Frank Zaczyk. Frank was a sailor in World War II. He served on the USS Sutherland. There's a copy of his muster roll from the ship. And every Saturday, my dad would take my grandma grocery shopping, and I would sit with my grandpa for a couple of hours, and he would tell me war stories. He would tell me about what it was like to be in the Navy during World War II, what it was like to serve on the Sutherland, the people he met, the experience he had, and it completely shaped and made me really, really interested in serving in the military as a future career. So why are war stories important? War stories are important because they connect us to our history as a people. They connect us to our loved ones and help us learn and appreciate the things they did and the sacrifices they made in ways we didn't understand before. And then they inspire us to do a little bit of good. And so that picture at the bottom right is my wife and I the day that I left command in the 101st Airborne and subsequently came here to the Graduate School of Business where I started working with the MIA project. Now I'd like to ask and have you ask yourself, can you imagine what your life would be like if those stories were never told? Take a moment and think about that. Wipe away every war story that you've ever heard, every story of service and sacrifice, all the things that kind of shaped the way you saw the world from the people you loved and cared about who served. And imagine what it'd be like if those stories disappeared. Who would you be? How would you see the things around you? And what would it do? With that in mind, I want to take a second and acknowledge the fact that for 80,000 families and 80,000 U.S. service personnel across the country, they still have not had their opportunity to tell their story or have their story heard because they're still missing. So the map you see in front of you is a density map of the number of MIAs missing across the country by state. The map is completely interactive, and so I'd like to take a different spin on this, and I'd like to ask you guys a few questions as we go along to kind of help guide this so we can work together to kind of put these puzzle pieces together. So the first question I would like to ask is, anyone a transplant? Anyone not a Wisconsin native here? Okay, so what state are you from, sir, with the hat?
Ohio.
You're from Ohio. All right. Well, what we can do here is we can take a look with new analytics software, and we can take a look at Ohio, and we could get a good image of exactly how many folks have gone missing from Ohio. So there are a total of over 3,000 MIAs from the state of Ohio. We could take that a step further and look at multiple states at the same time, compare them, and take a look at the different densities, and we can also take a look at exactly who those people were, including the units that they served in, the combat that they saw, and the date that they went missing. All of this information has been gathered from open source databases. This is readily available on the Defense Personnel Accountability Agency's website, and you can pull down the lists as the same way that I did and start building charts and graphs like this. But this gives us an opportunity at the national scale to take a look and see where our missing come from. Which brings us to our team. So all those 80,000 stories that haven't been told yet, we are dedicated to telling them. First in Wisconsin and then nationwide. Focused right now on World War II, but someday every conflict in the near future. And the way we do that is by researching in great detail, locating where we think these remains are, and then recovering them to bring them back home to their family members. So we are a team of cross-functional experts in fields like archaeology, anthropology, business, in my case, history, and many other disciplines. And we're about 60% students, all volunteers, who go about this work because it's the right thing to do, but it's also an enriching exercise for all people involved. And as a result of the efforts of the team that was founded in 2015 by Charles Kinzinski, we've brought 3 service members home and reunited them with their families. So First Lieutenant Frank Fazekas hailed from New Jersey. PFC Lawrence S. Gordon, the Biotechnology Center actually did the sequencing on here, and he was from Canada, and he actually enlisted to fight with the U.S. Army in World War II. And then Second Lieutenant Walter Stone from Alabama. So Frank Fazekas and Walter Stone were both pilots whose planes crashed, and our teams did the archaeological recovery and the battlefield history to put the pieces together to tell their story and return them to their loved ones. Lawrence Gordon was an infantryman who actually was misidentified originally, and after the team here at the Biotechnology Center did the sequencing, was correctly identified and reunited with his family. Beyond the obvious, just this is the right thing to do, this is the right thing to do to honor the sacrifice of these people, there's a very real return to the students who participate in this. So if you saw next to my name, it says volunteer. Our entire team is volunteer. And for most of the students, they're getting hands-on, real-world experience in education and research at the archival level, which is difficult to do, leadership development, communication, teamwork, and then continued service in a small team environment. These are hands-on, real-world experiences that you just can't get in a lot of places, and they're offering it right here to students who are willing to participate. So now kind of the bigger picture and kind of the anatomy of how we go about making a recovery. We start broad, and really when we think about telling a story, we go about looking at the densities you see on the maps that I showed you earlier, and we use that to identify areas where there are high densities of missing in action soldiers. From there, our team historian, Sam Zinnin, takes a look at the MIA database and finds Wisconsin missing MIAs who are in that area or in that concentration. And then we start to build from the widest possible area to the narrowest identification of an individual person. So we start with things like unit records. We start with things like morning reports that were daily reports that were sent between units to higher command. And we also look at historic reconstructions of battles, because it's not enough to just know where a single soldier stood in a single formation. We need information from the units to the left and to the right, because in the instances when a soldier fell sometimes, they weren't recovered by their unit. So you have to reference and cross-reference other unit reports, and you have to look at morning reports to see where this person's name popped up, or where they might have gotten moved to, or who may have come through and policed up casualties following a major battle. Once we've done the broad level analysis that gives us a good idea that our missing in action soldier was present at that location, we move on to individual analysis, where we may need to make a hard determination about the probability of a recovery. If we determine that a recovery operation is plausible, we'll need to pull things like individual deceased personnel files, X files, and then MACRs, which are missing aircraft crew reports. All of these documents go together and they tell us a lot more about the person and the circumstances surrounding the last few moments of their life. In either case, whether we are actively doing a recovery operation or we're launching what we call a closure report in the instance of a case where recovery is improbable. A good example of that would be a sunk ship. With the technology we have now, it's very difficult to think about exhuming remains from a ship that's at the bottom of the sea, and it's an unfortunate reality. But in either case, whether we're providing a closure report that details that service member's life and service to their family members, or whether or not we're considering taking on a recovery operation, all of those documents need to be pulled. And all of those documents are located at different archival sites across the country. And it requires time, it requires coordination, and it requires a great deal of effort from a very small volunteer team, which is where the analytics come in and where the future tech comes in. Once we've determined that a recovery operation is feasible, we'll use certain site analysis tools like LiDAR, GPR, and ERT, which are just multiple methods of scanning the ground and the contents underneath to determine whether or not there is something under there worth digging for, to help us identify a crater, and then from that crater to be able to identify and hopefully exhume remains from it. That is the anatomy from start to finish of what it takes to go through a dig. And even though I can display it to you on one single slide here, make no mistake, this takes months. Each document needs to be requested. You need to know exactly what you're looking for, who you're looking for, and you need to have a very good idea of how to find it. So it takes a long time. So any steps we can make in the right direction of being able to hone in on exactly what we're looking for are extremely important. That's how analysis is changing the way we work. So there's two items in front of you. The first one is a spreadsheet. That's a snapshot of the database that we work off of. And the second is a very simple chart. And just at a glance, which one of those shows you more that you can use right now? Anyone? Top or bottom? Top? Anyone? All right. So the bottom one gives us a very quick snapshot of information we can use, and it allows us to break up things. So for example here, I've taken the totals inside of that database by conflict, and I've been able to break them down into bins, and now we can take a look at Wisconsin's missing in action from World War II, for example. And we can get a total count of the people missing, but we can also take a look at where they went missing, their name, and then the unit that they served in. So let's briefly return to our national map. So now these new technology allow us to look at data in similar formats. And we won't dive back into this map fully because honestly, at a glance, although it is cool, it doesn't give you a whole bunch of information to chew on. You might want something more specific. And that's where we can go into looking at this data in a different way. So you're seeing the exact same information being given to you in a different format that you can still interact with. This is a chart of all the missing in action by state, including Puerto Rico and Guam. If you see here, Wisconsin with 1,516, but then also other states, as you might expect, with higher population densities like New York, suffer a higher number of MIAs. Moving on from here, we can extract certain pieces of the data and use it to do some analysis about Wisconsin's level of contribution and the amount of devastation that happened as a result of MIAs up to date. So as you can see here, I pulled the 1940 population of each state, and each of these color codes shows the density of MIAs compared to the population during that period of time. And as you can see, Wisconsin's population was about 3 million, and they suffered in World War II alone 1,325. So with that, they sit right around the middle of the ratios of states who lost. Wisconsin sacrificed a great deal in service to the country, particularly in World War II. And again, this doesn't account for killed in action. This is only missing in action soldiers. If we move down to the bottom chart, you can see that in terms of the population ratio, no state lost more than, or no state is missing more than 1% of their total population based on 1940s numbers. However, even though these fractions of percents don't seem like a lot if you just look at raw statistics, these are individual lives. And in the case of Wisconsin, that's 1,500 individual lives and 1,500 individual stories that have yet to be told. We can further break down the information and return to the totals by conflict, but we can also take a look at things that serve our purposes in terms of identification, like service component. So Wisconsin lost or is missing the most in the Navy with 508, which makes it difficult to recover them from our standpoint. However, with 505 Air Force personnel, recoveries become a lot more tenable. And we can take a look at that to see where those plane crashes occurred and how we can isolate those for future recovery operations. We can also see the impact of the missing across the state. So what you're looking at right now is the number of personnel who went missing in the year 1941. If we speed that timeline up, I can show you what it looks like between 1941 and 1972 when the last Wisconsinite went missing. Although the colors are a little bit hard to see in the presentation, they are broken down by service component, and each service component had a great deal of loss. In much the same way as the country had higher proportions of MIAs with more populated regions, so too do places like Milwaukee have higher numbers of MIAs, which makes intuitive sense. But the number of MIAs across the state and the amount of distribution between counties is staggering. So if we take a look at Madison, for example, we can see that each service branch has missing in action personnel in Madison. And from there, we can see what year each of them went missing in and the number of people who went missing. And again, we can see exactly where they went missing, who they were, the dates they went missing, and what unit they served in. Is there any other towns that anyone would be interested in looking up? Anyone come from any place besides Madison?
Green Bay.
Green Bay? So if we take a look at Green Bay, these are the numbers for Green Bay. Korean War losses as well as World War II. with a large number of people inside of the Pacific Theater for World War II. We can get more into this in the Q&A section if anyone would like to, but the point of this was just to show you the interactive capability of this type of a map. So this data is now fueling an opportunity for folks of all generations to be able to experience their history in an interactive way that's meaningful and also makes the significance of the sacrifice hit a little bit closer to home. We can then take that same information and take a look at where Wisconsinites went missing across the globe. We can then use this information to hone in on a certain area, perhaps an area where we've done a recovery mission in the past and have known relationships that could help benefit us. So if we take France, for example, we can see who our MIAs are from France, and we can start looking at the units that they were associated with in order to be able to figure out and get unit records for areas where we might be able to find more Wisconsinites. Beyond that, we can also take a look at time analysis trends of when Wisconsinites went missing. So what I'm about to show you is a month-by-month view of every Wisconsinite missing in action by month. This is broken down by service component, as you can see. And there are particular days in Wisconsin's history that were extremely bleak for our missing in action. We can see the numbers start to tail off in Korea and then in Vietnam as well, with one Cold War missing in action Wisconsinite still out there. But if we take a closer look at a particular date, we can see here in October 1944, Wisconsin suffered its highest number of MIAs. Very interesting, but what does that tell us from an analytics standpoint? With a very, very cursory search, we can determine that on October 22nd, 1944, the Arasan Maru, a Japanese hell ship, was sunk with over 30 Wisconsinites on board. This was a Japanese prisoner of war ship that was unmarked and sunk by the Americans because we didn't know what it was. Out of the entire group of prisoners of war, over 1,700, only 9 of them survived the sinking. And over 30 of them were Wisconsinites, some of which came from the Janesville 99, who also suffered through the Bataan Death March. Again, we can pull out the information that we're seeing inside of these charts, and we can look at areas where our Wisconsinites are concentrated in a few specific locations. So if we take a look at July 29th, 1945, we can see that we have 27 missing in action soldiers spread out over only 3 locations, most of whom were in the Philippine Sea, and most of whom were on the USS Indianapolis. Information like this allows us to guide our search procedures. It helps us get the information we need more quickly and at less expense in both time and money to bring more Wisconsinites home. To give you guys an idea of what that looks like, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the individual files that we put into the analysis of actually making a recovery. So, as I was saying, our team historian has made trips to National Archives and has worked with private investigators or consulting firms that do some research in this area. And all of these different forms are just the basis of what it takes to find an individual. The aerial reconnaissance photos of crash sites, this is an example of the Fazekas crash site. And an interesting fact about this is that 75 years ago when this photo was taken by British reconnaissance forces, if you'll notice the road immediately north of it was north of it. But when our team went out to do the dig 74 years later, the road had been moved because of a railroad getting put in, and the road was then south of it. So the eyewitness reports were off, and our team had to use some of the other high-speed technology that they had available to them to be able to locate the crater and actually bring Lieutenant Fazekas home. But that gives you an example of the sense of urgency and how much technology we need to bring to bear to help solve this problem, because geographic changes like that are sort of the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 75 years, when it comes to World War II, there's looting of sites. There are private archaeological firms that do this type of work for, I would suppose, less than honorable reasons. And then there's just also general erosion and just general tolls of time that take place. The second is a missing aircraft crew report. These are generally written up from crews after the plane has gone down and they've returned back, and they write these down. They're not the most detailed, and understandably so. X files are associated with missing in action personnel who are unnamed. So if you have a body, but you cannot be determined or identified, you have an X file associated with you. And then individual deceased personnel files are for personnel who have names, but bodies have not been located. All of these documents help us paint a full picture of exactly who the person is that we're looking for, so that when remains are exhumed, we feel confident that we are finding the right person and bringing them home. There are also significant opportunities for advancement inside of the analytics field. So as you saw on the previous page, all of those documents are in PDF format. PDF format takes a long time for a single historian to read, but with advancements in text recognition technology, we can scan those documents rapidly and use them to find similarities. We can also use analytics available right here at the university that scan the web and search for relevant documentation, open source and available on the net. We can nurture our own database that'll allow us to grow our own excavation techniques and make determinations about probabilities of recovery and help us better understand the conditions that the remains might be in when we find them. And then finally, our open source databases help inform the types of reports we could expect to find for cases. There is now an upswell in the amount of open source data available, including databases that include information on every single mission that was a bombing mission flown during World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And then supporting weather and light data for those times so that we can help understand what reports will be better than others because of the situational factors involved in every single crash that involved a missing in action soldier. But most importantly, this analytic software allows us to acknowledge the sacrifice of Wisconsin's missing in a meaningful way that honors their sacrifice. And it also helps us bring more missing heroes home to their families. That picture at the bottom is Frank Fazekas Jr., who was 6 months old when his father was shot down and crashed in northern France. Our team was able to reunite him with his father's remains, and we couldn't be more proud of that accomplishment. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions, but I'd also like to open the floor for interaction with any of the things you saw here tonight. I know this wasn't the longest presentation in the world, but hopefully some of you have questions or you want to learn more about the stuff you just saw. Yes, ma'am.
Could you refer again to what's the name of the ship that had the prisoners aboard? What was, I've never heard that story.
The Arisan Maru was the name of the ship. And so if we look at, let's see, the timeline. Oh, no, never mind. Excuse me. There's the spelling right there. Arisan space Maru. Yes, sir.
Does the possibility, does the location kind of determine where to go, since it's a volunteer thing, you only have so much money to do this?
Mm-hmm.
So it excludes probably C type.
It does.
So are you pretty much, land-based type things?
Yes, very much land-based. Right now, we've focused on World War II cases in the European theater, primarily France, and then most recently in Belgium. But yes, you're absolutely right. From both a technological and a funding standpoint, underwater recoveries are extremely difficult and also require a level of technology that we just don't have right now. Yes, ma'am.
So you found 3. How many are you close to adding to the first 3 you found?
So it's a difficult answer to give without, how can I phrase this? So in terms of closeness, we don't maintain a priority standpoint. We have several cases right now that our historian looks into very, very regularly. Right now, we are tasked with one case per year in conjunction or in partnership with the Defense Personnel, POW-MIA Accounting Agency. So those have been the primary cases we've focused on. I don't want to tap dance around your question, but I also don't, the absolute, and I hope you could understand, the absolute worst thing we could do is give any one particular family a false sense of hope or closeness about how close we are to their particular case. But there are, several cases right now that we are reviewing very, very thoroughly.
At this stage, does the technology allow you to read diaries of servicemen? I'm curious because it was written. Do you have any of that information, or you only read PDFs?
So I personally don't have that information, and I don't want to give you bad information about how far along it is, but I know that the text analytics software is out there and in use for things that are typed. So I can say that with certainty. I don't know about handwriting or handwriting recognition.
What's the possibility of focusing on New Guinea, the north end of the Kokada Trail, where I think there was a Wisconsin and Michigan National Guard unit in 1942 with about 2,000 Americans, I think, were killed in that battle. I'm assuming there would be a lot of MIAs with that.
Yes, so I know what you're referring to. There are certain locations, as alluded to before, right? So there are certain locations that are more difficult to send teams to, either because of, political tensions, because of security risk, because of risk of infection or disease, cleanliness, hygiene, things like that. No location in the long span is off the table. But right now, we've maintained our focus in the European theater of World War II. And so that's about, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what it would take, whether it's there's enough people, enough potential recoveries there that would start tipping the balance. My dad was in the Pacific Theater, and so I'm one of these people that thinks the Pacific always gets short shrift. Not that I mean to. So I'm wondering what that would take.
So right now with the volunteer team that we've had and just kind of the capabilities and some of the constraints that we've had for the team itself, we haven't done anything in Papua New Guinea or in the Pacific Theater as a whole, and we haven't diverted from World War II. I think the best answer I could give is just that in the future, anything's possible, and we certainly would, if the evidence gave us reason to believe that we could make significant recoveries there, it is definitely something we would do.
Would that show up on the map?
Absolutely. So if we look at Papua New Guinea, we have a total count of 96 here. From, it seems like a pretty diverse set of units, but there are plenty of Air Force as well as Army and Marine Corps.
So that's 96 in Papua New Guinea from 1940 to 43.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, yeah. 43, 44, 42, yep, all the way out to 45. Yep. Yes, sir.
My dad flew out of Papua New Guinea for the Navy and ended up ditching an aircraft on the beach in Australia. He said his flight, when he had to do his pilot logs, it never caught up with him. He was still in Papua New Guinea, and he was in Australia.
So I think what I'm understanding you're saying is that sometimes the documentation doesn't always catch up with our, whoever the missing in action might be. That's certainly something we've run into. No report is perfect. You're in the middle of combat operations, large scale at that point. Things are happening fast, and yes, reports, times, things like that. That is all part of why we pull so many different records. So if you look at one unit's particular record, the time might be slightly off. But that's why we look to the unit to the left and right, and we also pull some of those morning reports and those battle reconstructions to be able to get a holistic picture so that one documentation error does not hinder a single recovery.
The Australians keep very good records on downed aircraft,
Mhm.
and I've no doubt that some of them would have survived. But typically, when they found a downed aircraft, there was no one around.
Mhm. I think that all goes back to, so we do, to touch on one point there, we do have networks of other organizations who do help with some of that file sharing, that data sharing. And in some cases, we've made relationships with historians overseas who do help us with some of that local research and documentation. Our team historian actually does go about pulling historical reports and records, not just from friendly U.S. units, but also from enemy units, if they are publicly available and accessible, to paint a holistic picture of what was happening on both sides. So it is more than just sort of the broad brush, brief presentation. We're pulling from a lot of different areas, which I think highlights the importance of being able to hone in on a lot of the specifics here, because it's just less information we have to pull, or at least more specific information we have to pull. Sure.
You must have a much better success rate with like airplane crashes because they go into the ground with a body.
Yes.
Versus infantry that could be, scattered pretty fast by animals and things if they die on the surface.
No, absolutely. No, that's very true. So in the case that, but you have to remember too, so with aircraft, you have many different types of aircraft. So there's sort of I don't want to say an ease of recovery, but there is a certain sort of prioritization scale that comes with even aircraft alone. If you're looking at, single fighters with a single pilot, significantly easier or more tenable to make a recovery on that type of an aircraft than, say, a bomber with 7 crew members, where some of them may have evacuated the aircraft before it crashed, versus a cargo aircraft with almost 30 personnel on it, where some may have evacuated, some may have gone down with the bird. And then it all kind of, you throw in the mix of terrain as well, right? So there's, aircraft crash all over the place, and depending on the actual slopes that you're dealing with, the thickness of the vegetation, and just the general erosion, or the closeness to bodies of water where erosion happens and carry away can happen very rapidly, there's a sliding scale there. But certainly aircraft much easier than infantry on the ground, especially since infantry on the ground, things are happening much more rapidly, and whoever is coming through and policing up wounded personnel, killed in action personnel, and moving them off may not be keeping the same records as the unit that's now moving forward. That unit that's now moving forward may also be a little bit less accurate, as this gentleman stated, in their own reporting as well.
Along those lines, since the Fazekas recovery in 2016 and 2017, and then the Chuck, was it the Walter Stone, was that the name, from 2018? Those are both P-47 aircraft. Yes. Would either you or Chuck or Ryan want to do a comparison and contrast just to show how much similarity or difference there might be, even when you got the same aircraft in the same general area?
I was not on either of those digs, so that's a great question. I'm glad we're live broadcasting this. Didn't you ask me to speak? And I'm kidding.
Yes, I did. But I'm trying to get at the idea how difficult, even though you have 2 aircraft in the same general area, and how different they could be, because I'm guessing that they are not necessarily real similar, and getting at the previous question of the differences in what you have to do. It's going to be case by case by case, and pretty tough.
There's a lot of truth to that, because the previous 2 cases were in northern France, and those were in a clay soil, which penetrated down to, on one of them, the Zaczyk case, we went down over 5 meters deep before we got to that case. And so that's not a 5-meter deep pit, that's a 5-meter terrace down. So that becomes a huge hole that you have to excavate out. So the logistics of that kind of an excavation excavation are quite daunting. We have some experience with a different kind of topography and a different kind of soil.
We can't disclose that.
Yeah, we can't get into that, but
That's why I'm quiet.
that'll be next year's presentation. We're kind of under this non-disclosure agreement with the DoD with regards to current cases, with regards to what Chris had already talked about. But just suffice it to say that when an aircraft hits a different kind of soil that has a much rockier substrate right underneath the soil, and a very thin topsoil, I think the proper word is probably taphonomy, the site formation is way different than what we experienced with the cases in northern France, which was a clay soil. And that has different implications both for how deep it goes, but then also preservation as well. So there's a lot of factors that both positive and sometimes very, very negative, because we have a distinct dislike for clay. Why?
Sir.
Peanut butter, it's like peanut butter.
Yes, sir.
Relative to the X-Files, where you have some remains, but maybe not the identification, are you getting support or help from the private industry, especially with the growth of DNA analysis, from Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and so forth?
So, not directly in terms of, so a lot of times the X-Files are tied to unknowns who are buried overseas. So there's not DNA analysis on that. That is not remains that have been sequenced but are just sitting there waiting to be cross-identified with someone else through mitochondrial DNA. So in that regard, to the best of my knowledge, no. There is no coordination of that sort. However, there are similarities that we can find and have found in the past between X-Files and missing in action personnel, where we can be reasonably sure that the remains we are looking at or would want to go after are connected to an X-file of a missing person. Does that answer?
I think so.
Okay, all right, good. Yes, sir.
Switching to North America, are you aware of a plane crash that went down during World War II in Yellowstone National Park? And it was not discovered until like 4 years ago because of the radar and radio communication was such that they went off the radio, off the radar, crashed, and nobody knew where they were, so they were all MIA.
I was not aware of that particular crash, no. But we do have crashes of Wisconsinites in Canada as well as Alaska. So we do have North American crashes as well, North American missing personnel.
Are those on your radar?
They are. They are on ours. So if we look at the global map, you can see that we have missing in Nova Scotia, as well as the Phoenix Islands, Alaska as well.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Yes, yes, sir. You, sir, in the blue.
About how many groups are there in the U.S. that are doing similar work?
That's a great question. There are a lot. The short answer is that there are different functionalities or different specialties. Some groups have proven very, very effective at historic research, doing Freedom of Information Act requests to the U.S. government to be able to obtain files and then store them on servers to be able to help people just get information that they need. There are other academic institutions who are partnered with the DoD to be able to do some of the archaeology work, some of the genealogy work, in our case, sort of the full gamut of recovery work. I don't have an exact number off the top of my head, but there are, in different capacities, many organizations who do look into this type of work. Yes?
I see in your map there is a big circle in India.
Yes.
In the center of India. And I was wondering, the British were ruling. Was this kind of a joint operation, probably Air Force involved in it?
There was a great deal of Air Force planes flying over some of the mountains in that area. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of those plane crashes that occurred within that area were actually cargo aircraft that were going over. So we have a great deal of aircraft crashes in the mountainous areas of India. Yes, sir. You in the back? In the red polo.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Since you have a multitude of sources and resources to get data from, and you've done probably a statistical analysis of the data, what kind of percentage of accuracy do you think that the data you have represents within a total perspective? And I know that's kind of a big question to ask, but you've looked at a lot of stuff. But
sure.
Where do we come from there?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of, so if you're going to assess like a statistical probability of accuracy, so the databases that we're operating from are actually not plentiful in terms of the amount of information that is detailed to a point where you could make a reasonable calculation about a probability of recovery. That is sort of the field that we're going into. And even then, in terms of statistical probabilities, you're looking at some sites in some cases that are 75, 80 years old, where you aren't necessarily able to draw any type of a reasonable, you can't really quantify exactly what you're looking at. So the best thing we can do is take as much as possible to help hone our research efforts, if that makes sense. But there is probably it may be the case that we don't have the technological access now, but this data, this analysis is better served to help us research and find specific locations, because that is a monumental task in and of itself. When it comes to calculations about soil acidity, erosion, things like that, it's 75-year-old information, and it may not be accurate from that point that it was written down 75 years ago. So in terms of the accuracy of what I showed you, 100%. Came off of a database with a list of names, but even then on the national databases, there are some units that are not accounted for, and there are some MIA locations where there's just nothing listed. So additional research would need to be done in those particular areas.
So you're basically running about a flip of a coin then, about a 50-50 chance?
No, absolutely.
What it sounds, are we, which side are we leaning towards?
So we lean towards so in terms of whether or not we go out and do a recovery, that is more than a 50-50 chance, because there are criteria, like I said, water losses and things like that, where you could look at it and you could say, hey, probability is low here. I can't give you an exact number, but sort of to the earlier gentleman's point, there is an ability to facilitate a recovery that comes with a fighter, that comes with a bomber, that comes with a cargo plane versus infantry, versus Navy, versus Marine Corps, in terms of where they were and how detailed the unit records are. To break that down per case would take a lot longer, and frankly, information that I don't have. And then even when you get to a site, as reasonably sure as we can be, we are still pulling individual records for those personnel. We are still trying to pull information about what personal effects they have on them, the time that they left, or were they married, were they not married, any additional information we can find. So if we find a detailed piece of information on site, we can look at it and go, reasonable probability that we're in the right spot. Not quite 50-50, better than that. But at the same time, once you're reasonably confident that you're in the right area, you're now fighting 75-year-old soil, you're fighting different conditions, you're fighting, have the roads changed, has the geography changed, do I still have eyewitnesses alive? And all of those things compound. So it's difficult once you get on the ground. We've been very fortunate to be successful, but it's also due to a large amount of scientific expertise and just cross-functional expertise to be able to get us in the right area, digging in the right spot, and finding the right things. You, sir.
Yeah, how much of the data that you're getting for a particular entity, like the X files, et cetera, how much of that has been made computer readable or accessible, or all, when you ask for information, are they just pulling paper records from their files?
So there is a movement right now to digitize files within the DoD. To the best of my knowledge, at this point, the archives have digitized everything from A through L, and then they are currently working on everything in the alphabet after that. There are multiple different ways to pull, and in some cases, our historian has gone down to the archives and pulls from stacks and binders of things that have different information. But even then, it honestly takes a level of history expertise and archival research expertise that a lot of these young students have when they're majoring in history. But it does take a lot of grunt work to get in there and do the digging. So it is not as easy as Google and find. But like I said, there are organizations out there that we do actively talk to who have spent decades putting in those Freedom of Information Act requests, pulling the information, and then building their own databases of digital files to be able to share in certain instances. So it's a multi-pronged approach, and there's more than one way to get data, and there's also several locations across the country where that data is housed.
So the process you walked us through is, starting big with a lot of the data you had, and then looking at like individual specific documents, if I was following correctly. Would there ever be a situation, like before you actually go on the ground and like begin, the excavation or something like that, would there ever be a situation in which you maybe go to a location and then rely on kind of just take a step back and look at those individual specific documents, or is it, usually the process that you walk us through?
It's usually the process we walked you through if those documents are readily available. Sometimes we have to go in without them, and in some cases in the past we have entered a site without the individual personnel files. And in some cases, like the Fazekas photo, that photo actually came to us through the efforts of our teammates over at the DPAA while we were at the dig site to be able to find that and push that down to us. So you don't always have everything, but generally we have enough to put us in the right location, because you can't just go around and look in the woods. But you don't necessarily have all of the detailed information, because sometimes it's not available for the individual. There was an archive fire a number of years back where a lot of that information was lost. So in a lot of cases, it's not accessible. Yes, ma'am.
So when you are relatively sure that you have a location, do you have people on your team who do the diplomatic work, or do you then turn your results over to a governmental agency who gets permission to enter countries and do research?
So yes, but also no, and I'll hit that. Okay, so when we are entering into a country, the legwork and the logistics that goes into getting dig permits, getting landowner permissions, and then just getting approval, letting embassies know we're coming, all those different things, letting local governments know we're coming, letting them know what we're doing, we do that in-house. When it comes to recovering and handling remains, when we find remains, those are turned over to the local government and then handed over through an official chain of custody. We do not handle that. Sir.
So what do you think is a reasonable estimate of how many recoveries you may be able to make? 'Cause obviously the Navy, that's pretty much out of there. Maybe 2 or 3%, you think, or 5?
Sure. So it's hard to put an exact number on it, but part of what the project does is, in the instance that a recovery is not possible, like I said, go back to those closeout reports. So the goal is, to be honest, the goal is 100% of accountability to families. So in the case of a Navy water loss where we would not be able to exhume remains, the goal there is to be able to give the family a detailed report of their loved one's service, which oftentimes they wouldn't get otherwise unless they were going out and they were seeking those documents on their own. So for us, we can take a look at the service component numbers. It's hard to say, like I said, among the infantry cases, it's hard to say how many of those are tenable just by looking at numbers on a graph. But certainly priorities or probabilities go up when you're looking at plane crashes and things like that. So those would be the kind of numbers we were looking at there. But in every case, our goal is every family in Wisconsin knows exactly what happened to their loved one. That's the end state. And every community, too.
Any other questions? Chris, what's the success rate?
Success rate for the team right now is 3 for 3, 100%. So out of all of our missions, 3 for 3, and not allowed to discuss the 4th. So, but we're very proud of the successes that we had, but we're very hungry for more, and we're very hungry to bring this back to Wisconsin, because there's a lot of communities in this state that deserve this kind of closure. Yes, sir.
What's the size of the team and the makeup of all the volunteers, if you don't mind?
Sure, no, absolutely. So the core team, the folks who kind of work here every day. So since it's all volunteer, Charles Kinzitsky is our team lead, but his full-time job is Associate Director of the Biotech Center. So I'm an MBA student. I serve as the operations manager. Sam Zinnan is our team historian, and then Tori Tiedemann is our communications manager. And those are sort of, on a day-to-day, we're sort of running and gunning for the team. But beyond that, we have folks like Ryan Woobin, who's our field physician, who volunteers a tremendous amount and also does research and engages with the team every day. And then throughout the state, we have, I would say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 volunteers who just, whenever needed to do a little bit of research, we can reach out to them and ask them for a little bit of service. The team this past year on the recovery mission was 21 people, about 60% students, along with some faculty members from UW-Waukesha, as well as faculty members here and administration at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So.
Folks have to pay your own way when you're overseas?
So no, we operate under a contract with the Department of Defense, so we are not compensated, but the costs are covered through that.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.